So today we're going to be covering the respiratory system, and before we get into the individual organs and their functions and whatnot, we want to go over a brief summary of the expectations that I have of you guys when it comes to what you should be learning within this chapter. So first we're going to be summarizing the role of the respiratory system in the body just as a whole. We're going to talk about inspiration and expiration. What do those terms mean? And what's the physiology that's going on behind both of those terms? Then we'll get into the structures of the human respiratory system and the individual functions of each of those structures. We'll discuss internal and external respiration, what those terms mean and what's happening on a physiological level. And then when we get to the end, we'll talk about some various respiratory conditions, both of the upper and lower respiratory systems. So when we look at the overall goal of the respiratory system, it's to get oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. That's really the main function, the main focus of the respiratory system. And in order to do that, to bring oxygen in and to get carbon dioxide out, we have inspiration, which is when you breathe in. So another term could be inhalation, right? Where air is going to be pulled into the lungs, through these cavities, through these tubes, deep into some of these structures we're going to get into a little later. And then expiration, which expiration sounds kind of negative, sounds bad, but it just means exhalation, right? When you breathe out, right, you push air out of your lungs via the same exact structures. So the pathway that we take to bring air in is going to be the same pathway we use to get air out. And when we look at inhalation and exhalation, or inspiration and expiration together, we can call that ventilation or breathing. Now, the respiratory system does not function on its own. It's not a standalone system. It has to rely on other body systems in order to really get its job done. Mainly the cardiovascular system, since the cardiovascular system is going to be receiving that oxygen and moving it around the body, as well as getting the carbon dioxide from the body and bringing that to the lungs. So these two systems, the respiratory and the cardiovascular systems, are really going to be working hand in hand. And when we look at things like cellular respiration at a much deeper level, when we look at the individual cells, we're looking at the cells and how they use oxygen and produce carbon dioxide. Now, we've already kind of talked about cellular respiration in a previous chapter, so we're not going to really dive too deep into that at all in this chapter. Just try to remember what you can from cellular respiration a few weeks ago. So when we look at the respiratory tract within humans, we can really give ourselves two areas or two divisions of this system: the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. Now, the upper respiratory tract is basically everything involved in the face and the throat. As you move down from the throat into the chest, that's where we get into the lower respiratory tract. So if we look at the upper respiratory tract here, we have the nasal cavity, which are going to be found within the nose, the pharynx, the glottis, and the larynx. And then once we move down into the lower respiratory tract, we find the trachea, the bronchus, which is singular, bronchi for plural, the bronchioles, and then the lungs, which are going to contain alveoli, which are little air sacs. And then very at the very bottom there, we see the diaphragm, and that's going to be the muscle that's going to help us with breathing, or one of the main muscles that's going to help us with breathing. So let's start with the upper respiratory tract, where we have the nasal cavities, the pharynx, and the larynx. So the nasal cavities are going to open out what are called the nares, or the nostrils, which are going to lead to those nasal cavities. Nasal cavities are separated by a septum. So if you think about that popular piercing that a lot of people have got in the last months or years that have become very popular, right? It's that piece of flesh that you see between your two nostrils. And within these nasal cavities, we have hairs as well as mucous membranes that are going to help trap small particles, trapping dust, dirt, debris, things that you would not want to get deep inside your lungs where the more sensitive tissues are at. So here we're looking at a more detailed look of the upper respiratory tract, right? And so if we look right around here, we see the nares, right? That's where air is going to be coming in when you breathe in. the nasal cavity, which is a large open space, again, filled with hairs, filled with mucus. We're going to be trying to warm the air. We're going to be trying to catch any debris before we move back towards the pharynx. So as we head back through the nasal cavity, we get to that pharynx and we see it's broken into 3 locations: a nasopharynx, an oropharynx, and a laryngopharynx. And all those terms mean they're just associated with the locations that they're close by. So the nasopharynx is close to the nasal area, the oropharynx is close to the oral area, and the laryngopharynx is close to the larynx. And so as we continue to move down through the pharynx, we see that the pharynx is going to work kind of as a fork in the road, where we can either continue forward in the anterior side, where we go through the glottis and the larynx, which is going to lead us to the lower respiratory tract, or let's say we were eating, we could go through down towards the esophagus if we were following the digestive system. But in this case, we're going to focus on moving towards the larynx. So before we leave the upper respiratory system, let's look at the nasal cavities a little bit deeper. So they do have a mucosa and submucosa, just like we saw with the digestive system. We had those different layers. And so the mucosa is going to help produce things like mucus that are going to help trap those particles and move them up the pharynx, up to the pharynx. And in the submucosa, we're going to find a lot of capillaries, right? And with that large amount of capillaries, we can warm and moisten the incoming air that we're breathing in. This is also why we can be susceptible to nosebleeds, because you have a lot of blood vessels that are on the fragile side, that are bringing a lot of blood to that small area. Within the nasal cavities, we also have odor receptors, which is what our sense of smell is going to be coming from. We'll talk more about odor receptors when we get to the nervous system, so we're not going to really go beyond just knowing that there are odor receptors at this point. And then up in the eyes, you have tear glands that are going to drain into the nasal cavities through the tear ducts. And that's why when you cry, you can get a runny nose, right? That clear liquid runs through your nose. It's actually tears that have been produced in your tear glands and that have made their way down into your nasal cavities. Once we go into the nasal cavities, we pass to the nasopharynx. Again, that's that upper third of the pharynx. And also connecting to this area, we have the auditory tubes, or the what are called the eustachian tubes. And that's going to connect us to the middle ear. Again, we'll talk more about that when we get to the senses. So we've moved through the nasal cavities and now we're down to the pharynx, right? And this is a funnel-shaped cavity. This is what's that we called that fork in the road that's going to connect the nasal and oral cavities together. And it's also going to provide us where we can separate out between what we want to go down to the digestive system and what we want to go down towards the respiratory system. As we pass through there, we will see the tonsils. Now, we talked more about the tonsils in the digestive system, so I'm not going to go really too deep into them, but do remember that they are part of the lymphatic system. They are made of lymphatic tissue and function similarly to lymph nodes, and they're going to be found at that junction of the oral cavity and the pharynx. So way back, kind of in the back of your mouth, right before you'd get to your throat. We pass through the pharynx. We've decided we're going to the respiratory system, and so now we're going to move to the larynx. This is a cartilaginous structure, meaning it's made of cartilage. That's going to be between the pharynx and the trachea. And this is where your vocal cords are going to be found. So you might be sitting here right now and thinking, wow, Miss Marks, your voice, it's kind of annoying. You can thank my vocal cords for that. There's an opening between the vocal cords, and this is called the glottis. So the glottis is the open space. It's not a physical structure, so to speak, and that it's made of tissue. When air passes through this glottis, the vocal cords on each side are going to vibrate, and it's that vibration that gives you the sounds that you hear. Now, you would not want food getting into your respiratory system, and so if you are eating food, the larynx is actually going to move upward against this structure called the epiglottis, and this epiglottis is going to help kind of close off the respiratory system. It's going to close off the larynx so that food is forced to go back down through the esophagus instead of getting trapped into the respiratory system. If you were to choke on food, it's because this process of blocking the larynx has not quite functioned right. And so some food or liquid, something that you've consumed, has gone down, quote, the wrong pipe. And so here we see those vocal cords. So the glottis, again, is the opening, and you see those two, almost like an upside down V-like structure. Those are the vocal cords. And so as these vibrate, that's what's producing the sound you hear. That's what's producing your voice, are these guys right there. So we've made our way through the upper respiratory tract, and now we're finally hitting the lower respiratory tract, which is probably what you're thinking of when you think of respiratory system. You're probably thinking of the lungs. But before we get to the lungs, we have to start from the very top of the lower respiratory tract, which is going to compose of the trachea. This is commonly called the windpipe. It's reinforced with cartilaginous rings. So if you were to take your fingers and kind of push them a little bit, not too hard, but push them along the front of your throat, kind of down as you get towards your collarbone, you can kind of feel those cartilaginous rings a little bit. And if you were to do something like a pig dissection, you could actually run your nail along the trachea and feel those cartilaginous rings as well. The trachea is going to connect the larynx to the primary bronchi. Now, bronchi is plural, bronchus would be singular. And so if you think of the lower respiratory tract, we're kind of going to be looking like an upside down tree. The trachea is going to look kind of like the trunk of the tree. The primary bronchi are going to look like the main branches before you get into all the little branches and leaves of the tree. Now, as we go down through the trachea, we are going to be lined with pseudo-stratified ciliated columnar epithelium, as well as goblet cells. So pseudo-stratified, if you remember from histology, tells us that we are going to be an epithelial tissue found in a single layer, although we're going to appear like we might be more than one. Ciliated tells us that we have cilia, which you can see in this picture here. That looks like little kind of broomsticks in a way, little broom bristles. And then columnar, again, that just tells us the shape, that they are column-shaped. The goblet cells are those blue cells you're seeing between all the pink epithelial cells. And these are special cells. They're going to be the ones producing mucus. And it's these goblet cells and epithelial cells that are going to be working together to help make sure that that dirt and debris that may not have been caught up towards your nose is going to get caught before we get to the lungs. Again, the lungs, when we get to them, we're going to learn that they're kind of sensitive and they're really thin and easily damaged. And so if you have some sort of particle, some sort of dust, something that you don't want to get into your lungs, the cilia and the mucus can kind of work together to sweep up and clean up that debris. So the mucus produced by the goblet cells can trap that debris, and then the cilia can perform a sweeping motion to move those particles up and out of your respiratory system. As we move down, we get to the bronchial tree, where we have those two primary bronchi, one leading to one lung, the other leading to the other lung. Those primary bronchi are going to branch into secondary bronchi, and they'll continue to branch, similar to a tree where you have your main branches, and then those branches have splits into smaller branches, and finally smaller branches, and smaller and smaller and smaller. We're doing the same thing here, from primary to secondary, and then finally we get to these teeny tiny ones called bronchioles. Think of the bronchioles like the twigs you would find in a tree. And then at the very end of these bronchioles, right, we have this elongated space with all these little air sacs that we call alveoli. So if we're using our tree analogy still, you can think of the alveoli like little leaves. Right, and so here's an image showing what that bronchiole would look like, and those alveoli at the very, very end. Right, so they kind of look like blackberries or something of that nature down at the very end. And you notice that they're covered in capillaries. So before we get into the alveoli themselves, let's talk about the lungs as a whole, which is what's going to be consisting of the secondary bronchi, the bronchioles, and the alveoli all together. The right lung is going to have 3 lobes, while the left lung only has 2. And the reason behind this is that on the left side is where you're going to find that heart. And so there's not enough space for that left lung to have a 3rd lobe, whereas the right has enough space since there's no heart pushing in on that location. So it can have its 3. Each lobe is going to be divided into lobules, and each lung is going to be enclosed by a membrane called a pleura. So now we really get to the workhorses of the respiratory system, and that's the alveoli. When you're looking at the lungs, you're looking at about 300 million of these alveoli, because these are the ones doing the work. They're the ones doing the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now, we already pointed out that the alveoli are surrounded by capillaries. If you remember, capillaries are made of a simple squamous epithelial tissue. And so the alveoli are also going to be made of simple squamous epithelial tissue. And the reason that we are simple squamous is because we want to be very thin. We want things to be able to squeeze between the cells. We want things to be able to diffuse out very, very easily. That's what's going to allow us to perform gas exchange, where the air inside of the alveoli, we can take molecules from that air in the alveoli and diffuse it into the blood in the capillaries, and vice versa. We can take gases that have been dissolved in the capillaries in the blood there and diffuse them out into the surrounding air inside the alveoli. So that's our primary goal here, is that oxygen and carbon dioxide are going to diffuse between the air inside the alveoli and the blood found inside the capillaries. Now, these alveoli need to stay open in order for this process to work, and so to keep these alveoli from closing, we have a surfactant that will keep them remaining open. Even when you exhale the most you can possibly exhale, right? If you took that moment right now to just as much as you possibly could, your alveoli would still remain open because of this surfactant.